guess.
Yeah, thanks. Yes, I'm Ben Kalla, and I'm going to be talking about how I found some exposed data science clusters which are used for big data analysis. I'll describe how you can run code on these exposed clusters and what you might get if you do, and how I can work out who owns a cluster I find in the wild so I can report it to the owner. And then I'll finish with some recommendations. So I started a new job, and we got this email from AWS Abuse telling us that someone was using our EC2 instances, our resources, to perform DDoS attacks, which isn't great. So after taking a look, I discovered they were part of an EMR cluster. So EMR, or Elastic MapReduce, it's an AWS service that lets you fairly painlessly spin up a cluster of tens of EC2 instances. They come with a collection of open source data science applications installed, and it's all connected to your data lake in S3, which is where you dump your exabytes of raw data files that you want to be processed, like for your machine learning or whatever. There are several useful tools running on the master node of the EMR cluster that people might want to access remotely. And if you follow some of the tutorials on the AWS blog, you'll end up with ports for some of these services exposed to the internet, which is an issue because the majority allow you to execute your own code on the cluster. So top right, we've got Zeppelin, which is basically the same as Jupyter Notebooks. You get interactive notebooks, so obviously you can run code on it. Bottom right, we've got the Livy web interface, which is, when there are applications running, it's just going to show the status of your running applications. And it looks like there's no functionality, so it's not too dangerous to expose it, but it has a REST API that allows you to submit applications to the cluster. On the left, we've got the resource manager. So the resource manager has a queue of all the applications you want to run on the cluster. And it's where you submit your application. You tell it what resources you need, so how many containers, how much memory, and then it looks for space in the cluster to run your job when it's available. And again, this interface is non-interactive. It looks like there's just logs and application status, but it also has a REST API which allows you to submit code to the cluster. And bottom left is the resource manager again, but it's not an HTTP API. It speaks protocol buffers with a custom protocol. So this is kind of what the resource manager web interface looks like if you've left your cluster open to the internet for a while. So you've got 10,000 applications in the queue, which is the default maximum queue length. And there are lots of these jobs with name get shell. So this tends to be the bash-like malware, which is what's performing the DDoS attacks. And it's running as user Doctor Who, which is the anonymous user in Hadoop. But if you want to log in as a different user, you can usually use the passwordless Hadoop simple auth, where you put user.name equals root in the query string, and then you will have root permissions on the cluster. So normally, if you want to run applications on the EMR cluster, you'll use the AWS EMR APIs, but for that, you need AWS access keys. However, we just found an open port where we can talk directly to the cluster software. So in order to submit our application to that, we can talk to the resource manager, for instance, and ask it for a new application. It gives us an application ID, and then we submit the application specification. You don't need to read that, but it's just giving it some environment variables and telling it the location of the code and some data files that you might need. Then the resource manager is going to launch the application master container somewhere on the cluster for your particular application. And your application master is then going to ask the resource manager for the resources it actually needs to run your application. And then when there's space on the cluster, it's going to schedule and run your job. Now, normally from the internet, we're only going to be able to connect to the EMR master, which is where these interfaces are exposed. We're not going to be able to usually talk to the machines inside the cluster where the application actually runs. And also, normal EMR applications, they write their output to S3, so we're not going to get the output from that because we can only talk to the resource manager. So you'll need to get your jobs to ping back to your own server if you want to get something out of it. So what code do we want to run if we find an exposed cluster? So the malware is doing something which makes use of the compute resources of the cluster. So things like running DDoS, and that's gonna cost you a lot of money in the network traffic. Mining Monero, they're probably not going to make that much, but yeah, you can do that. And if possible, you want to run this in parallel on the cluster. You got to make sure you ask for enough memory because the cluster has some monitoring in it, and lots of malware only gets to run for a few seconds because it gobbles up too much RAM and gets killed. But apart from compute resources, there's very little of interest stored on the cluster machines. What you do have is potentially from your foothold inside the cluster, you might have security groups which give you access to databases or other hosts. But what I'm mostly interested in is just grabbing AWS credentials because that's where the fun stuff is. And grabbing credentials is actually quick and simple because you don't have to run your code distributed on the cluster. One way to do it is to specify a custom command that's run to launch the application master container. Because if the container launch fails, the resource manager receives 4 kilobytes of the error message. So we can set our container launch command to print temporary credentials to standard error and then fail. And then we're going to be able to grab the credentials from the resource manager log. So I was interested in how common this misconfiguration or leaving these ports exposed was. So I did a bit of a port scan of the EC2 IP range, try and get some credentials from clusters, and then I can do a targeted enumeration of those accounts in order to give me clues as to who owns the accounts, and then possibly I can report them to their owners. So once you receive AWS credentials, the first task is to get the associated account ID. Doesn't give you much information, but it's just so you know if you've already enumerated this account and you can ignore it because you're going to get a lot of repeat customers. Next, you want to list the S3 buckets and a handful of file names in them, maybe. This is where you get all the good information. I probably have access to all the buckets in the AWS account. So that's your data lake, backups, code, logs, you name it. Most buckets I found in one account was 913. You can almost always list them, but in rare cases when you can't, I can guarantee that there's a bucket that exists with this AWS logs account ID region. So if you can probably access it and plunder the contents to hunt for clues in the EMR cluster logs which go in this bucket. Apart from that, the other buckets with just account ID and region don't give you much except you know what regions the resources are in for further enumeration. But what I'm really looking for is bucket names with a company name in them. So that's probably the best clue I'm going to find. Occasionally, if you find someone's name, you can go on LinkedIn and search for data engineers. You do need to be a little careful because sometimes you'll find Salesforce or Uber in a bucket name, but it's just that a different company's Salesforce data or their Uber ride receipts for expenses. And a bucket I find quite often is like Terraform state. You don't get anything from the name, but there's usually lots of juicy secrets in the Terraform state. It's quite a useful bucket. Apart from S3, SNS. So you might have an event like monitoring alerts, and on SNS there are subscribers to the event. That could be a Lambda hitting a webhook, sending SMS or email. So if you list the email addresses and they're all from the same company email domain, that's a great clue as to who owns this cluster. It's very common to have permission to list all the EC2 resources of the account. So you can look in tags. Tags of the instances might have an email address. Security groups will probably name the office or the person's person's home IP address. You'll usually have access to DynamoDB, but it's not so useful for clues. And then there are a bunch of other services where you'll find secrets and all sorts of interesting things, but that's rarer. It's more like when they've launched the cluster with basically administrator access. So on to regions. AWS instances are hosted in different regions, and over to the east you'll find the CN region, which is China. So it's a partition of AWS, which means it's like a parallel universe. So you can use the credentials, but you have to contact the CN AWS endpoints. The creds don't work on the endpoints on this side of the Great Wall. And again, US Gov is the partition called GovCloud. So that again, you can only use them against US Gov endpoints. I only had access to this once, and I found that I could use the credentials on the cluster, but when I took them onto a different machine, they didn't work anymore. I don't know if that's normal or not, because I only had a short amount of time with that one. So, is this a common misconfiguration? So in total, scanning intermittently over about a year, I found 900 AWS accounts. As far as figuring out who owned them, about half of them weren't very relevant. So they were either test data and tutorials, or I just couldn't figure it out. Further 8% were Amazon accounts doing proof of concepts. But I managed to find I managed to report 11 of the clusters to get bounties each between $250 and $17,000, but vastly skewed to the lower end of that. So that was actually 10 companies because I got one double offender. So recommendations. If you want to access one of these web interfaces on your cluster, the AWS documentation will now recommend SSH port forwarding. So for this, if you use a command like this, as long as you can SSH into your cluster, with this, if you go on your web browser and access localhost port 1234, your SSH client is actually going to route that onto the master node of your cluster on port 8088. So this is a more secure way of accessing things without having to open lots of random ports. Abuse of your infrastructure for DDoS is going to cost you money, and the credentials leak is going to be much more damaging. So EMR big data tools are remote code execution as a service, so don't expose them. But really it's a dumb bug, and it's kind of an organizational issue, I think, because in our case, it's just the data scientists opened the ports so they could work from home. And I'd say, love your data scientists, but apply the same controls to them as you do to developers, which could be training or change control, or such as Terraform code review, because they're often a blind spot of the security team. So have DevSecOps look after them. And yeah, not everything manages to get reported because, it's very difficult to find a security contact for a lot of places. So yeah, that's my talk. I found some exposed data science clusters. Yeah.
Any questions for them?
So the ones with bug bounty programs obviously paid out, so the ones who were upset. Some just didn't care, or was like, it's tough reporting. I don't know. There were lots of different types of companies. Some I just can't figure out, or I wasn't too sure how they would take it, so I was a bit too scared to actually report it to them in the first place. Yeah.
I have a question. What about the other half? The other half of your data set, you don't know who the companies are.
Yeah, I don't know, I'm afraid. Well, so at some point, maybe they're going to notice that they will get emails like I got that they're probably ignoring about their instances being abused. But I just couldn't work it out. Like, either they had locked down their permissions of their account so that I couldn't do the enumeration. Like, I might have been able to access like buckets with lots of their data, because they're obviously processing data, which is why they've got the account.
AWS directly?
I don't think they care. I mean, so it's sort of the AWS shared security model, which is like they take care of the security of the cloud. But if you want to like expose your stuff and give code execution to the world, it's not really their job. Like, they will send you emails if it's affecting their services, like your AWS is being used for DDoS. But other than that, they're gonna have so much. Like, and this is just one thing. Yes. Yeah, so a lot of things, like I can tell, but like they're just doing like tutorials and they don't have anything else in the account. So I can tell from the bucket names that they're a common data set. But sometimes they've launched these tutorials, but it's in an account with all their other like the test account of a company, and they might think it's okay as a test account, but they've still got like all their code and a bunch of like staging instances and things. So, I mean, it looks like sometimes I see a lot of bucket names talking about NYC taxi data sets. It's just like, so there's lots of stuff just working on that. And that's probably how they've ended up exposing it to the internet, because it's their first time playing with it, rather than running a production cluster.